Jamie, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's the proudest moment of my mother's life when I could say I was a doctor. She tries to blur the bit where it's literature, but, you know, partially happy. Can I just say, I am not partially, I am entirely happy today because I am sitting on a stage with a personal hero of mine. Mishal Husain is not just a consummate professional, never a hair out of place. I took a little, I was working this morning, I did a programme this morning, and I left, and I said, I'm going to do Mishal, and there was this whole sort of, oh, she's so great. Oh, she's so brilliant. Did you see her? Yes, everybody saw her. She never has a hair out of place. I know. I know.
Hairspray is a wonderful
No.
thing.
And then it went on. She's always so very calm. And then I opened up one of the reviews today of her brilliant book, which you all must get, Broken Threads. And I found out that in between doing the Today programme and turning up to do an interview about her book, she's managed to bake biscuits. Can I just say you're quite hard to like? Seriously.
Yeah, I promise it's not an everyday thing when I come off air. Yes, it was. An interviewer was coming to my house, and you know, in our tradition, how can you have someone come to your house and not feed them something? So I did some zero biscuits, basically.
Yeah, zero biscuits as well, right? Not ordinary vanilla biscuits. I mean, I'm going to try and get over all of this because I do like this woman and her book is very, very good. Is it a bit odd for you, though, to be on this circuit and be answering questions instead of asking the questions?
It's definitely very odd. You're in control, not me. That is definitely scary for someone who's usually on the other side of it. I think, actually, it is in my school days, we would have said it's a character building experience. I generally do think it is good to be on the other side of it, and it has made me think about what interviewers put people through. I'm not expecting this to be like an 8-10 on the Today programme, I hope.
Well,
let's see.
I mean, you carry on baking biscuits, ladies. There's no guarantee of how I'll be.
But it has been, sort of. It's a tricky month because this publication day was last Thursday, and then it so happened that I was just doing this small thing of the 7-way election debate for the BBC the day after. So
which you chose not to leave early. Well done. It's very good.
So I feel. I feel only now can I really enjoy the moment of having a book that I worked for 3 years on out into the world.
Well, I very much want to talk about the book, but I very much want to talk about the 7-way debate. You want to hear about this, don't you? No. Just before you go on stage and you're facing something like that, the weakest link kind of setup of all of these people in front of you, and you know how important it is and how many people are watching. Do you actually feel any kind of nervousness before that?
Yes. I mean, and if you didn't, I would say that you wouldn't be taking it seriously enough, because there are days that are fairly normal broadcasting days, and then there are days, whether it's on your normal programme, for me today, or the BBC One News, or a very unusual program like this, and of course you have you sort of need that rush of adrenaline, and the nerves come with it. But I always, I am quite methodical at preparing for things, and yet so you do that to the best of your ability. But of course, live broadcasting, it has its own energy, it has its own sparks, and that's why we have it, and that is its special place even in the world of very, very successful podcasts, such as that done by some people very close to me right now. Live broadcasting is a different beast, and so you always have to be prepared for the unexpected, and you want the moments that make people think, did I just hear that? And of course you want it to be a high standard throughout.
Well, I mean,
it was definitely a high stakes and high pressure moment.
I mean, I don't know of anything that you have done that have not been to a high standard. And one of the things that strikes me, particularly when you're in a really pugilistic kind of interview, is that you always retain your cool. You always have that sort of line that you don't cross, and nobody knows what's sort of going on inside. It is something very, very different. In fact, completely contrary to that when you have to look into your life and talk about your family. So, I mean, are there sort of 2 or 3 Mishal Husains all wrapped up in one? Or how do you have to do some kind of strange gear shift to get into another state to do that?
I think I have been in two very different zones for the day job and through writing this book. And actually very few people knew that I was writing this book, partly because, as you and other authors will know, it's quite difficult when then people say to you, well, how's it going? And you're like, as far as you're concerned, until you get to the, final... And even then you worry about it, right? So you're never really going to feel it's going well. And so to sort of avoid those questions, and because this was very personal to me, and I wasn't, I didn't know when I set out on it how big it was going to end up being. I set out thinking, okay, first I thought I'll write something about the lives of my two grandmothers, one Muslim, one Anglo-Indian Christian, who were born in the early part of the 20th century and who saw educational and career opportunities that were not possible for their mothers. And there's a story of social mobility and women's lives transforming going on there. And then I thought, actually, my grandfathers wrote things that are really interesting and I want to use. So I thought they can be in the book as well, although they haven't ended up on the cover. Only the ladies made it onto the cover. And then as I started looking into their lives, which are obviously 20th century lives, I thought, in the case of my Muslim grandparents, certainly the two who were born in the north of India, their families' lives, such a massive influence on them was the aftermath of the uprising / mutiny / First War of Independence, that I thought, I'm going to have to go back to 1857. I wasn't expecting to do that, because that moment of the British really entrenching power and showing that they weren't going anywhere was so instructive to the decisions that their families made about how they were going to earn a living, what jobs they were going to encourage their children to do. It was the moment where, Muslims in particular, but all communities thought, okay, well, we have to make decisions that are based on the British being in India for the foreseeable future. And so they went into the professions. In my grandparents' case, the army, medicine, elsewhere, the police and the civil service to some extent, as a process of Indianization was happening. But I didn't expect my canvas to get so big, and it was quite frightening because, unlike you and others, I'm not a professional historian, very far from it. And I had some family sources. I had to fact check those sources and read around them. And so I found this project get bigger and bigger in a way that was really daunting. And I didn't know where I was going to say, okay, stop, no more. I can't go down any more of these avenues, I have to call it.
But what you managed to do is you managed to take in that very huge canvas, but also give us some really rather tender and delicate portraits. I mean, I'm sort of a little bit in love with both Tyra and Mary, I have to say. Well, we'll get into that in a little while. But I'm also sort of keen, that question, where are you from, is such a loaded question. I mean, among us, people of brown skin, when you ask somebody, where are you from, often it's not about, Essex or whatever. It's about, where did your grandparents come from? What is your story? Have you always been aware of your history and your story?
See, mine is sort of possibly... I find it hard when people ask me, where in the UK are you from? That's a really hard one for me. I was born in Northampton, but my parents actually, by the time I left hospital with my mother, my father, who was a junior doctor in the NHS at the time, had already moved on to his the next of his 6-month postings, or however it worked in those days. So I then grew up in the Middle East, but that's probably why I think I was probably more connected to my South Asian heritage than I might have been had I grown up here, because I'd spent every summer with my grandparents in Pakistan, in Rawalpindi, and I sort of knew that it was not, it was their home then, but I knew that their roots were across the border in Aligarh and Lucknow, and I knew from a young age that there was something strange, like these places were geographically very close, but no one ever seemed to be able to go there, and I didn't really understand why. And I also knew that these places were incredibly important to the way that we were being brought up. And that was because, our manners, our Urdu, the way we spoke, the way, everyone had to be bhai or apa or khala, or, there was certain, I called my grandmother a chiammi, the good mother. There are not that many children growing up in Pakistan today who are calling their nani or their dadi terms like that, but this was very much the culture in which we were rooted.
Yeah, bin shak ye sab log soch rahe hain ki Mishal Husain Urdu bol leti hai, waqai. And you do?
बिल्कुल उर्दू बोलती हूँ.
There you go.
I mean, kamzor ho gayi hai for sure, but I had to give an interview to Geo News just the other day in Urdu, and I'm afraid the interview looked a bit disappointed as the conversation continued, but I did do my best.
Can I just say, I know what you're all thinking. I just know what you're thinking. Let's start with the genus of this story, because it's called Broken Threads, and there is a really rather beautiful talisman that sets you off on this, the sari fragment, and a wonderful picture in the book of Thyra's wedding to Shahid as well. How is that sort of so important? You should tell people that story.
Yes, so the 4 grandparents whose lives I trace do come from 4 different places, and only one of them is in the territory of present-day Pakistan. That's Multan. That's where my father's father came from. And my father's mother was born near Anakapali, which some of you will probably know, near Visakhapatnam in present-day Andhra Pradesh. And my mother's parents were born in Aligarh and Lucknow, respectively. And they got married in 1940 in the middle of the war. Shahid, my grandfather, did something that his future in-laws really didn't approve of, which is that they got engaged and then his orders came to deploy to the front, and he said to his about his fiance's parents, I'd like to marry her before I go off to the front. And you can imagine this didn't go down well at all. You know, she could have been a widow immediately, but they did get married in the middle of that time. And when I got married in 2003, one of my mother's cousins came from Pakistan to the wedding here in London, and she brought me a shawl, and the shawl was a plain coloured shawl, but it had this very lovely embroidered border which had been stitched on, and she said, this border is all that remains of the sari that my mother, i.e. my great aunt, was given at the time of your grandparents' wedding. So Shahid and Tara, my grandparents, got married in 1940, and the groom's parents gave each of his 5 sisters a sari to mark the occasion or to wear at the wedding. And the silk had gone over the years, but the border remained, and Shameen, the daughter of this great aunt, had removed it and stitched it on a sari, and she gave it to me, and she said, you know, this is a fragment of a gift to mark your grandparents' wedding. And the thing is, the reason I was particularly surprised is because I knew that Shameen was a very young child in 1947, and her own mother had died by then. And they made a very hurried departure from Lucknow, and I thought, someone packed this sari of Jamila's, even though they were leaving just with a couple of bags, and thought, Shameen should have this one day, you know, we'll pack it and take it. They went by train to Bombay, as it was then, and then by boat to Karachi. And so it was even more precious because it was not obvious that it wouldn't just have been left in the house. You know, as many people left things thinking we'll be back soon. And my great-grandmother, I don't know for sure whether she thought she'd be back. She certainly didn't want to leave Lucknow. It was, you know, she was very, very much rooted there. Her late husband was buried there. And as it happened then, Shahid, my grandfather, because he was in the army, he only made it back to Lucknow once in his life in about the 1970s. And that was because there was a friendly Indian High Commissioner in Islamabad who said, I think I can get you a visa. I can't issue the visa in Pakistan. You know, he'd been long retired from the Pakistan army, but it wasn't going to be possible. But he said, are you going out of Pakistan for anything? And my grandfather said, yes, I do have a business trip to Hong Kong. He's like, you can pick up the visa in Hong Kong and you can go to Lucknow. And that was the only time. And he said, I just want to pray at my father's grave again.
Yeah, I mean, that relationship with Zameen is so important. It's such a lifeblood to that generation, to the point where actually they didn't talk about the loss. But your grandmother Thyra was very good at describing that sense of loss, of being displaced.
She did, and I think that, you know, while this session is called Partition Stories, I really want to say that my book is about the before and after. It is a bit about that actual period, but it is part social history because I wanted to trace the society in which my grandparents grew up, which was a pluralist society, and in which there were many links across the communities, despite the fact that nationalism was growing and what was initially a demand for Muslim rights then did grow into the demand for a separate homeland. Despite that, there are many beautiful stories about the links then, the links in the worst of times in 1947, and then the bonds, although they Shahid and Tara lost all their friends, essentially, apart from the ones who were of similar background who did come to Pakistan. But some of their closest friends, particularly those they'd served alongside in the Indian Army, some of them they saw a little bit, or at least Tara saw a little bit after independence, when she did go through Delhi to see her parents who remained in Aligarh. But actually within a few years it became very hard to do that. It sort of became obvious that it made things complicated for those friends to have a visitor from Pakistan. It was making things complicated for Shahid, for my grandfather in Pakistan, that his wife kept going to India. So all of these things, I think that generation lived with a lot of loss. And yet, of course, so many people had suffered worse, had lost their lives, had lost, everything they had. And so I think they didn't feel that they had any kind of license to feel sorry for themselves. But Tyra was much more willing to say, I've quoted her because she talked to me about her life, and I have her on tape. If only we knew people in audio, maybe I could do something with the audio.
If only we knew someone in radio. Yeah.
But she says in her tapes, partition need not have happened. And I don't think that my late grandfather would ever have said that. I think that the two of them wouldn't have been in the same place on that.
Well, let's just, you have extraordinary grandparents, because none of them did what that generation was supposed to do, which is what their parents told them, turns out. So, Shahid and Tara marry, even though they're told to hang on and wait until you can see if he comes back from the war or not. But Mumtaz and Mary, I love Mary. Okay, so this is another story of people just bucking a trend here. So tell us the story of how these two met.
Yes, so there's one bit I won't give away, but Mary, my Anglo-Indian grandmother, her father was an Irish Catholic who, as far as I can tell, had been born in India. I suspect that his family were probably arrived around sort of in the aftermath of 1857 or thereabouts, as in her Irish ancestors, and she. Her father was in government service. He was a tax collector. I realised that when I made a documentary for the BBC about Mahatma Gandhi, and I've been on a big chunk of the route of the Salt March, and I realized when I was researching this book that my great-grandfather was pretty much collecting the salt tax. And I never knew that at the time, that I was tracing Mahatma Gandhi's steps, filming for the BBC. But his second wife was my great-grandmother Mariamma, who was born a Hindu and then converted to Catholicism in or around the time of her marriage. And there was a complexity around that marriage, which is a story I tell early on. But Mary also then lost her father very young in her life, and the family fell on really, really hard times. And it was the French nuns in the convent in Visakhapatnam who really safeguarded those children's education, because they allowed my great-grandmother to defer the fees. And the debt of the children's school fees, and there were 6 children, didn't get paid back for 25 years. And the nuns were also incredibly important to these fatherless children. They all completed their education. The girls went into nursing or became secretaries, so. And my grandmother went off. Actually, she didn't become a nurse because she got married to Mumtaz, but she was on the path. They said, we think you should go to the Mayo Hospital in Lahore because we hear that's a very good one. Now imagine, she's from Anakapali, south of Visakhapatnam, and she goes, what must it be, 2,000 miles to Lahore? And she knew one other person, which was another convent girl who'd gone to do the same thing earlier on. And she was only 18. She then does meet my medical student grandfather. And of course, their common language is English. He's grown up with Multani and Urdu and Punjabi. She's grown up with Telugu and English. And so they fall in love. And
it's a chaste love. It's a really sweet kind of old-fashioned.
She's a very devout Catholic. Yeah. And when meanwhile, his family have decided when he was a child that he was going to get married to his cousin in Multan. So they faced a lot of difficulty. I mean, they did get married, but their families didn't know about it initially, and actually Mumtaz's parents didn't accept Mary for quite a long time, until they had pretty much four children already.
But something extraordinary in that relationship was there was no expectation that either should change their religion, although both must have had that pressure on them, and many have gone through that and have shifted, but they didn't do it.
They didn't, but actually, I think probably Mumtaz's parents would have rather that Mary eventually became a Muslim, but I'm not even sure it was certainly never asked of her directly. He certainly felt very strongly. He was a very devout Muslim, my grandfather. You know, he would start every morning reading from the Quran that his parents gave him when he left Multan to go to medical school in Lahore. But this question I asked him directly: how was it your cross-religious marriage? And he said, we understood each other perfectly. We were each people of a very strong faith. He said, I couldn't have married anyone who didn't have a strong faith. You know, we were both believers, and this was our life. And she even, because they lived in Saudi Arabia when he worked for the UN after he retired from the medical corps of the Pakistan army, they lived in Saudi Arabia. He would go on Hajj every year, and she would just go along. So I think she's probably one of the few Christians who's done Hajj repeatedly, let alone done Hajj at all. And, you know, she was on his identity card, and I guess the Saudis never really thought about whether Mary was Muslim or Christian. She's married to Mumtaz Hussain. You know, most likely she's a Muslim. So
I just love this nest of rebels that you have emerged from. The other thing through Mumtaz and Mary's story that you get, and you know, I know, as you say, this is sort of partition voices, but what I found particularly striking was that you tell of a time when everybody was in each other's lives and there wasn't such a big deal about it. The medical school, for example, where the Hindus would come and try and, you know, eat the good biryani that was in the Muslim quarters, so the Muslims would go into the Hindu quarters because they did really good halwa puri on a Saturday. I mean, all of that kind of sense that you get.
Yes, and I remember with my grandfather Mumtaz, I remember asking him, because I was always so curious about their life before Pakistan came into being, and because you know, you walk into a shop in Pakistan and it's Assalamu alaikum, and I said, well, how did you greet people? I just wanted to know, like, how, and he said, well, we always tended to say adab, because adab was the, you know, just crossed
all boundaries,
crossed all boundaries, and so. But yes, I mean, King Edward Medical College, which was also the same medical college that educated my father 25 years later, is, you know, was definitely placed. Most of his professors were Hindu or Sikh. There was a quota system by religion, so that students were divided up, like 40% Hindu, 40% Muslim, and then Sikh, Christian, Parsi. So there was a quota for everyone. But, you know, amongst the stories that I feel I want to share, because obviously mine is primarily the story of Muslim families, but I am so conscious that the mirror image stories people here and others will have.
Well, you're sitting right across from somebody whose entire family was from Lahore and from Galabag, so everything that you're saying, I have the symmetrical reflection of that. Yeah.
And you know, in terms of the actual immediate aftermath of 47, there was Rawalpindi was, and to some extent still is, a garrison town. It had really been. It was the northern command of the old Indian Army. It's still the headquarters of the Pakistan Army today, and it was the place where Shahid and Tara, my grandparents, had their first posting when they arrived from Delhi. And there's an amazing old house in Rawalpindi which was built by Sardar Mohan Singh, who was one of the great Sikh industrialists who really built the town of Rawalpindi, and he had fled a few months before, but he heard that Shahid and Tara had arrived in Rawalpindi, and he probably realized they were living in Flashman's Hotel on the Mall in Rawalpindi. There was no accommodation, you know, everything's in a state of flux. And he wrote to them to say, please use my house. My staff are there. They will look after you. I'd like you to move into my house and live in it. And Shahid said to Tara, there is no way we're moving into that house. It is like a museum. We can't possibly be responsible for those treasures, but I'll get it guarded. But, you know, I thought thought, what an incredibly generous gesture to think like he has had to abandon this house in the worst possible circumstances, and he is offering it to a Muslim family who have come across the border. And you know, very sadly, that house was looted in the autumn of 1947, and many of its priceless treasures, carpets, antiques, you know, all kinds of, you know, Gandhara sculpture, old Qurans were looted at that point. But the building is very much still there, and is a university. And when my grandmother talked about it, she said, we had learned to live with each other over centuries.
Yeah.
And the society was such a simple one, and that these instincts were there.
I mean, just on the mirror image, my mother's side, her family members, when they came to Delhi and they fled in one of those terrible midnight escapes from violence.
A train?
Well, they actually didn't, on foot, and then they ended up in a refugee camp. And they didn't, like your family, just didn't take the train that was then slaughtered. But they end up in Delhi, and they're given an empty house in Connaught Place, which of course is not empty. An entire life has been left in there. And my mother always says that, you know, her grandmother always kept a box that had been left with all of the items, because one day they might come back and want them, for the Muslim family that had to flee the other way. So look, let's walk our way from these stories of people living together and living in harmony to things that ripped a continent apart. Shahid's path through this is particularly interesting because he was Sandhurst trained, and he came under the wing of a really interesting man, Auchinleck, which I think is somebody that not many people really talk about. Tell us a little bit about his military trajectory and how he finds himself in some of the most important chapters in that partition story.
So as many of you will know, after the First World War, when so many Indians served and fought for the British, there was then a realization that opportunities needed to change, and Indians, apart from in the medical corps, I think, had only been soldiers, not officers at that point, although there was a sort of in-between rank created called viceroys, commissioned officers. But the decision was taken that Indians had to be allowed to become king's commissioned officers for the first time. And so there was a process of Indianization that involved the setting up of the new military college in India and also access to the military colleges here. And therefore, my grandfather Shahid went through a competitive process in 1931, the autumn of 1931, to try and get a place at Sandhurst, which he did. And the passport that he had made and that was issued in Allahabad, now Prayagraj, in the summer of 1932 says his status is British subject by birth. And it's quite a fascinating document to look at. It's all watermarked Empire of India. And so he was one of the, I mean, he wasn't right in the first wave. The first wave had started in 1918, but he becomes a King's Commissioned Officer and comes back and has these extraordinary experiences as political, as nationalism and the political mood is growing. He's also involved in trying to, you know, control disturbances, which is a really, I mean, you've done so much work on Jallianwala Bagh and all of those incidents, and he has a couple of really, really tricky moments of public gathering which he has to deal with. But then in 1946 he becomes private secretary to Claude Auchinleck, who is the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, and they form a really good bond. And it means that Shahid and then Taira have this ringside seat between 1946 and 1947 as really important decisions are being taken on India's future. And he also sees all the difficulties of a process under which the Indian Army has to try and maintain law and order during partition at the same time that it is being divided. And that's a physical process. Units are like, these units will go off and join such and such regiment because that regiment is going to Pakistan and these units are going this way. And it's really extraordinary to think of the responsibility that was placed on the armed forces in the very time that they are being broken up. So it's an incredibly difficult time. But Claude Auchinleck, I think, is really a person who, you know, British history has forgotten. And I look at him and think, not only did he play an extraordinary role in North Africa in 1942, where he was the general before General Montgomery came in, who held Rommel and the Nazis in North Africa at El Alamein, and who then in 1947 has the authority that maintains discipline in the Indian Army at a time when police forces in many areas had become partisan and were often only interested in protecting people of their own faith. The army was not like that. Muslim refugees were being escorted by Hindu and Sikh soldiers, and the same thing was happening on the other side of the border towards India. And I think this was, to a very large extent due to the kind of authority and the command and the respect in which he was held.
Also, I mean, you use him, I think, in a really interesting way to describe the changes of British attitudes in India as well, because you talk of a time when it wouldn't have been unusual for a British officer to speak Hindi or Urdu, or to have some interest in the culture of the people in whose country they are serving. But Auchinleck, you say, is actually quite unique because he still has those old values, but many of the soldiers around him, many of the British troops, do not any longer.
His regiment was 1st Punjab, and so he spoke Punjabi, and as he would have called it then, as Hindustani, so he would have been able to make himself understood in Hindi and Urdu. And when he gave speeches, then they would be written out. They'd give a speech in English, it'd be written out in Roman Urdu, and he would read it in that. And yes, my grandfather Shahid saw some British officers who were nothing like that, and he was in the cavalry. He joined the cavalry at a time when it was still horse cavalry, and the horses didn't get replaced until the Second World War began. But he said, some British officers' speeches were just, embarrassing, if not actually offensive. When, as an officer was supposed to speak about savar, as in cavalryman, a mounted soldier, and they ended up saying sewer, as in, pig. So these were really bad mistakes, and but there just wasn't enough emphasis by that point on language.
Yeah, but that Auchinleck link is pretty much the reason that you're here, is it not? I mean, sort of that fleeing from, or having that intelligence to leave when they left and to avoid those death trains. I mean, that's a massive... And you often think, but for a small decision somewhere, or someone who hadn't met somebody, you wouldn't be here.
Yes, but the person who... This is... So Shahid, my grandfather, he left Delhi for Pakistan late in August 47, but my grandmother Tahira and her 3 children, including my mother, who was 2 at the time, were in Simla for the summer, and the idea was that they should stay there, and then when times were better they would leave, and then times just kind of got worse. And so from Rawalpindi, Shahid said to Auchinleck, please could you get Tahira down from the hills, because I'm worried about her. And he sent a young Hindu officer on his staff with a platoon of infantry. But this gentleman, Govind Singh, whose family I'm in touch with, was a really extraordinary young man. And it was still, even with a platoon of infantry, in a situation where law and order has really, to a large extent, fallen apart, there are so many risks along the way. And my eldest uncle, who was 7 at the time, remembers being in this vehicle coming down and Govind Singh saying to him, if anything happens to the car, you must say that you are Govind Singh's children, and you must say that your name is Hasu, not Hassan, and that your sister is Guriya, not Shehnaz, and that the little one is Chutu, not Shama. And of course, it was only years later that they realized he was trying to anticipate the situation where the adults were gone and what possibly could give these children a chance, and to try and disguise their identity in some way. And then actually when they got back to Delhi, where they stayed in Teen Murti Bhavan, because it was then Flagstaff House, and it was the house Auchinleck was living in. And Hassan remembers having the run of this extraordinary house into which Nehru must have moved a few months later. But the last thing that Govind Singh did for my grandmother Tahira, he was clearly very fond of her, is he brought her this box and presented her with it and said, this is for you. She was just about to leave for Rawalpindi on Auchinleck's plane. And she opened it, and it was a box full of jewellery. Full of jewellery, sort of about bigger than this book. And he said, this is for you. You are not rich people, and one day the children will get married and you will need this. And she said, Gomji, I can't possibly accept this. He was a relative of the royal family of Jaipur, and she thought, this is must belong to the family or to the state. And he said, no, these are my personal items. This has nothing to do with the state, but I would like you to have them. And she said, no, I can't possibly accept this. But here was he'd already saved her life, and then he was thinking at the last minute, I want to do something for the children, and he wanted her to accept a whole box of jewels.
I'm going to ask one more question, which is a pullback, and then I'm going to open it up to you out there. I have one request. Please don't do the shy hand thing, because I won't see you. And then you'll feel bad, and I'll feel bad for you. So just put your hand up very high and mighty, and then I will come to you. Wait for somebody with a microphone to get to you. But just finally, you know, on the major pullback, and we've barely scratched the surface of a really rich tapestry of broken threads that you've managed to weave together. But often people have an idea of the birth of India and Pakistan that was inevitable, largely sort of sourced in the work of Richard Attenborough and Gandhi. In doing what you have done and had a look at it, do you think it was inevitable now?
As in, for partition to take place? I think by the summer of 1947, it was inevitable. But I think there was a period a year before, and that was in sort of May, June 1946, and the cabinet mission plan, where there was a formulation that would have been more like a federation of India involving the states and provinces. And so there was a moment in time where things could have been different. But you know, I want to say that another aspect of this book is about British decision-making and British leadership in that period, and the responsibility thereon, because a lot of my work today is in political journalism, and so I am very interested in how power is exercised. And I did have to look into the British government archives, like just across the India Office collections have the whole transfer of power series on the open access shelves, and it was fascinating to look at how much power was concentrated in very few hands. Really, by March 1947, only Mountbatten and Attlee are really making the decisions, and the Viceroy had plenipotentiary powers that the Prime Minister had granted him. So even Auchinleck, who was the second most important person in the hierarchy of British India, that's why he was living in what is now Teen Murti Bhavan, and the Viceroy was living in what was then the Viceroy's house. So, you know, the Viceroy and the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Armed Forces, these are the two most important people, and Auchinleck was not part of the decision-making, despite having the responsibility for the personnel who, you know, did their utmost to maintain security.
Let's open it up to questions, right? Who's going? Oh, look, straight up. Okay, where are the mic holders? Could we have one to that lady there? Because she shot up in exactly the right way. And is there another mic holder on this side? Could you put your hand up again? There's a gentleman here on the front. Why don't we start at the front and then we'll move our way back? So if you can come down here, gentleman right here, and then we will do a sweep up and down. Yes.
Mine is not so much a question as just an identity check with Mishal. Like her, my grandfather was a British soldier, a captain. Like her mother, my mother was in Simla when the partition happened. Like her dad, I am a King Edward graduate. But just one sentence. 30 years on, I have been here and I was shown so much kindness by a Gori, not a brown. Like my first child went to Montessori, private Montessori. It was a very high fee. We could barely afford it. When my second child came along, I said to the lady, I said, I can't afford it. I can't give my two children the same kind of education. I want to give them the same kind of education. She said, no, you are not taking your child away. I have other kids who want to come in, and I saw them.
Right.
And they're going to pay the fee. I will not charge you anything.
Right, right.
And when we went away from there, another form of kindness, she said, no, last fee, no, you will need the move. So
Yeah, no, it's lovely to be reminded of all these sort of different strings of kindness that make us human. I'm going to take a question though, and if I could ask, and just please indulge me, just if you've got questions for Mishal, that would be the best thing. Yes, and I know you have. You look like you're a man with over here, just over here at the front. Yeah. And second question, anyone else got a question on this side? Put your hand up and then we'll get a microphone to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Very much a personal hero of mine as well, and thank you very much. That was very enlightening, and towards the end it's starting to get a little bit emotional as well. I haven't read the book, I've got it earlier. Okay, so my question is, one of the things I've recently uncovered, I was at a play, it was a play on Partition called Silence back in Manchester, where I'm from, and at the end of the play, a colleague of mine was at the back of the room, and came over to me and shared a story with me that they'd never shared, which was around a person that they grew up as their uncle. He'd only recently been told wasn't his uncle, and was a boy at the end of a train who grew up as their uncle. And it's a story because of trauma that was never shared to him, and he's only been shared now. And we have this dichotomy, which is the last of the witnesses of that period are with us, and we have so many fascinating personal stories in people's family archives, probably people in the room as well right now. How do we kind of find a way to quickly record those stories, and now we're moving up beyond trauma, share them? Even now, like a colleague of mine this week had just shared some stuff from his grandfather who was in the Holocaust, and it's almost like we've only got to that point where we feel confident enough to share it now. So it's the same period. We're talking about D-Day, Holocaust, Partition. These periods have so many fascinating stories that haven't been shared yet. Yeah. How do we do that? And especially with your process. Thank you.
Well, part of the reason I wrote this book now is it's somewhere I thought, you know, I will tell this story one day. And then I did become conscious that my parents' generation is also starting to leave us. I lost my father a few years ago. And I thought, if I don't try and capture this now, then I can't turn to it at the point when I feel ready. I have to gather it now. And I did find that I would say to anyone who's interested in this, if you can at least, you may never write about it, but just gather what you can right now. And in my experience, there are always, in every family, there are generally just some people who are much more interested than others. There will be a keeper of family history, and it might be a third cousin that you've never met before. But you know, we're so lucky now because with voice apps, I did a lot of my research on an app called Otter, which records and then can turn it into a transcript, and all of those. And if you feel that you have no sources of that kind in your family, then at least with the place names, you will be able to probably find people who, you know, were also in that particular place, and they did record, and therefore you'll have a very good, you know, idea of what your ancestors went through. But I do think it's really important because this is our heritage, and I feel a younger gen, my children, who are all teenagers, really have no concept of before their grandparents came to this country, and that's not enough of that. Those roots are too recent, and so I really hope that by doing this, hopefully other people who share the same heritage or just know that their grandparents were alive and going through, you know, somewhere in South Asia and going through this period at the same time, find something that they can also latch onto. Because there's a big story, which is essentially the shift from empire to nation state in South Asia, but it's also about how that big shift was experienced by ordinary people.
Thank you. Gentleman there with the hat, and then if we can get this microphone to this actually, we'll go back first and then we'll go forward. Can you just, we'll go here and then we'll go to you, sir. Yeah.
Mishal, this is probably a trivial question. Do you not get irritated?
Where is it?
Right here.
Oh, sorry, there you are,
Yeah,
sorry.
there we go.
Do you not get irritated by people who cannot pronounce your name? They keep calling you Michelle when it's Mishal. It's such an easy name to pronounce.
You know, I will say something about that, which is that actually when I was named, and I was named by my great aunt Amina Majid Malik, who was a wonderful educator of Karachi, and was also with my grandmother on the journey down from Simla that day. She said, the way she always pronounced my name was Mishal. So in Urdu, Mim, Sheen, En, Lam, and it's flame, which is really Persian. But of course, the same word exists in Arabic, and then it would be Mishal. So either in the sort of Persian Urdu, Mishal or Mishal, both are correct. But yes, you're right, it's not Michelle. Although the same great aunt said to my parents, you should name your daughter this because it will be easy for her English friends. They'll be able to call her Michelle. Yeah.
There are. Fewer reasons than you thought to be annoyed. Okay, like there's who has the microphone now? You have the microphone. Can I get a couple? There's a lady there. If you could just wave to me so that they know. Yeah, you. Yes. You'll get the microphone next, and then we'll move further. And then there's somebody over here. Oh, and somebody back there. Okay, we'll try and get as many as we can. Yeah.
Right. Anita, I feel like I'm in an episode of the Empire podcast, which is very cool.
What
really.
a privilege.
Oh, how nice.
They've got millions of downloads, those.
So sweet.
You asked, Mishal, was partition inevitable? I have a future-facing question, and it is, to some extent, with your experience as a political journalist. Do you believe reconciliation is inevitable? Or are we moving apart and becoming more different? Which way do you think this will go in 100 years or 50 years?
Thank you very much.
Well, I do get to this right at the end of the book, because I do have I am left with a massive feeling of loss. A big part of my heritage is, lies in India, and it is, I've had more, through my work and through having a British passport, I've had more access to it than almost any other member of my family. But to this day, I haven't been to Anakapali, and I haven't been to Lucknow yet, and that's like such an important part of my heritage. And I do feel that, the emotion that people like us feel, because we do, Anita feels attached to Lahore, I feel attached to Aligarh and Lucknow, because my grandparents talked about them. That's going to go pretty quickly, and most of the more than 1 billion citizens of India and Pakistan don't have that kind of contact and opportunity. So, and I think the loss of contact is, of course, something that starts to, how can you have reconciliation without contact? So I think, to me personally, it's a source of great sadness, and I really hope that, in future, we're at nearly 80 years, like surely over time there has to be space for, whether it's through trade or whatever other ways, for a better relationship than the first 80 years have illustrated to us. So, but that's why, again, I feel that these stories are important to record, because then they are there for the future. And mine is a story of society and social fabric and people reaching out to each other. And I think probably younger generations in India and Pakistan, as well as those of us with that heritage here, are simply not aware of that. So,
I just wonder, though. I wonder about that, because when I went back to Lahore, went to Lahore for the first time.
Went back.
Well, I went to Lahore for the first time, and I remember bursting into tears just walking down a little gully, because I thought, actually, my grandfather's little feet when he was a little boy would have walked down this gully, and it brought me very close to somebody who I grew to care for very, very much, and I was terribly emotional. And I told my friends, this is just such a big moment, and they just all rolled their eyes. I've got lots of Pakistani friends. I go, these bloody people who come back from England, they're so, God, they're like taps. You just can't turn it off. And I wonder whether it's something, it's a condition of being sort of, in another country again.
I mean, more for us.
More for us than for people who are Indians from India, who again think we're leaky taps, and Pakistanis from Pakistan who again think we're leaky taps.
Yeah, maybe because we're searching for something and we're trying to find our place, and I think because
we're looking for deeper soil to put our roots in, but they're not. I don't know. The answer is I have no idea, and anyone who listens to the Empire podcast will know that's the thing that we do. We have no idea. Anyone has got a hand up on this side? Who's got the microphone? Thank you very much.
Hi, Mishal and Anita. I really enjoyed the talk. My question is, presumably there were thousands of other men and women in the service of the British Army upon partition. What were attitudes towards them post-partition immediately? Was there a sense of, you've betrayed us, you've been part of, the British forces, and were they left unemployed after? How easy was it for them to kind of carry on with their lives?
You mean because they had been in the army through the time of the Raj? Well, I mean, it was very much the Indian army. The British army also had units, but you're talking about the pre-independence Indian army, which had Indians and British officers. By the time of 1947, the senior officers were still all British. There was only one Indian general by the time of independence, and that was General Cariappa, who then became the first Indian chief of the post-independence Indian Army. But I think there is a complicated relationship there. So number one, both my grandfathers experienced this, but only one was really articulated it, which is that that they, despite becoming officers, they grew up in a world in the 30s, for example, where there were still signs on clubs and other places which said Indians not permitted. And once you were in the uniform of a King's commissioned officer, you could walk past those. You could walk past the signs. And it was my grandfather Mumtaz who experienced that most dramatically, because he only went into the army because he left medical school in the middle of the war in 1943, end of 1942, and it was a terrible time for the Allies, and there was a desperate need for doctors and nurses, and he got a generous stipend, and that was why he joined. Of course, and I touch on this in the book, there was also the Indian National Army, those who joined the Japanese, usually after being taken prisoner in Malaya or in Burma. And Auchinleck had to deal with a judicial process on when those people were taken prisoner between 1944 and 1945. So I would say perhaps, and I think this is a little bit different in India and Pakistan actually afterwards, I think the truth is that the war was followed by such a massive upheaval 2 years later, 1947. I think the sort of it just started to recede a bit further into the distance, because there was all of the tumult of war service, and then there was for South Asia, a much bigger one straight afterwards with independence and partition. So I don't think my grandfathers felt any embarrassment about having served the Raj. I think it was, these were the job opportunities of the time. But of course, they were fighting for the freedom of other countries at a time when India itself was not free, and some people absolutely would have disagreed with military service in those circumstances.
Now, I've been given the 5-minute warning. There is a gentleman here who very much would like to ask a question. Is there anyone at the back? Because I feel you're neglected. The lady over there. So I'm going to take these 2 questions. There's a lady over there.
I'll be brief in my answers. So
no, that's fine. If you just look where I'm pointing. Hello. Hi, just up there. Can you wave? There we go. Lady in the grey. There we are. Thank you very much. So we'll take these 2.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask, what do you believe is the real impact in the imbalance in how empire is portrayed in the English educational system in regards to history? Do you believe that if there was a more balanced aspect of repenting rather than just reminiscing, then things like Brexit wouldn't have happened and a dream of Empire 2.0?
Right, okay.
So, hang on, I just want to get comfortable for this one as well.
If my editors are watching the live stream, like they will be, their faces will be turning completely white at this point. Yeah. I don't know if I can see it in quite the same way. I feel that there's the political history of empire, but my story is also how it was experienced. And I feel my grandparents' generation, part of the reason that that they make decisions about their future going into institutions which have the British at the top, and they certainly don't envisage independence happening in their adult lives. Not at all. I mean, New Delhi is only inaugurated in 1931, and it's very clear to me from reading about, my grandparents were born in 1911, 1920, 1922, that kind of period. There is, it's only really towards the end of the Second World War that they think actually the British might leave India like soon or immediately. I mean, so they really do have to grapple with, with completely changing times. I think as Satnam Sanghera is kind of most vividly illustrated in his work, empire is not properly taught, it seems to me. I certainly wasn't taught any history of the empire when I was at school. I mean, I only did history up to age 16, but I do wish that it had been part of the curriculum. And I sort of feel things are changing now. There certainly seems to be a mood where, certainly writers have really moved things on in the last few years with work in this area. So yeah, I think there's certainly scope for the curriculum to change, and maybe that does change the way we see present day events.
Thank you. Yes, and you're going to be our final question. No pressure.
I was very interested when you talked about like young people not knowing much about partition. My grandparents were probably 7 when they moved from Sindh to refugee camps in Bombay. And a few years ago, I was at a friend's party and I met someone who was Sindhi like me, but had a mirror experience of growing up in Pakistan instead of in Bombay in India. But we had the same language that we spoke at home, like barring the nuances of them being in Pakistan. And we ate the same food, which my grandmother made and that person's grandmother made. So when was the first time you had a realization that there are opposite stories that were very similar to yours?
I think not until I went to India for the first time, and that was with the BBC in 2005. When I grew up we were living in Abu Dhabi when I was growing up, and obviously there's big South Asian diaspora. So actually, I did grow up. My parents were friends with Indian and Pakistani families, so I did have that diversity in a way wouldn't have happened if I had grown up in Pakistan. But when I went to India for the first time in 2005 for the BBC, and I said to my mother, who had kept going to Aligarh as a child to see her grandparents until they left after the 1965 war, but she hadn't been to India for decades. And I said, I'm going to India on work. Shall we see if we can get you a visa? And we went together. And actually, it was when we both landed in Delhi. We went through immigration, and the immigration officer looks up and goes, "First time?" And I said, "Yes." And my mother just pauses and then just says, "Hum yahan aate the." We used to come here. And the man just kind of looked up and I felt in this moment, it was like we all understood each other perfectly. Yeah. He understood. And she felt it was the only way she couldn't just say, yes, I've come here before. She was like, there was a whole story behind that. But she did on that trip. I really regret this, but I was kind of quite bound to Delhi because of the my work commitments. But she did go to Lucknow and to Aligarh, and she saw the house which her grandparents had owned there, and it was really emotional. And I would, my mother's nearly 80, but it would be wonderful to travel to India with her again, and this time travel around with her, which we, because at that point I thought I had all the time in the world. And now I've realised that we really don't. We have to grab these opportunities when we can.
Well, can I just say, you can grab this opportunity and get a copy of Mishal's amazing book. That's called a segue. The radio thing. But please join me in thanking Mishal Husain for a fabulous, fabulous session.
Thank you so much.